Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Gabriel de Guzman, Director of Arts at Wave Hill. Thank you all for joining us for this Meet the Artist with Gyun Hur. Gyun's compelling project, So We Can Be Near, is on view in the Sunroom Project space at Wave Hill. Um, Before we begin, I'd like to mention that the chat function is available to use for general comments, but we also have the Q&A function. And that is what you should use to ask the participants any questions. You can ask questions in the Q&A section, which we'll have, later toward the end of the conversation. And now I would like to introduce our speakers. We have Curator of Visual Arts, Eileen Jeng Lynch, who will be leading the conversation with Gyun. Hi. And I'm also pleased to present artist Gyun Hur. So this Sunroom project is Gyun's first solo exhibition in New York. She has had solo and two-person shows in Atlanta, Chicago, and Hong Kong. Recent group exhibitions have been held at Brick in Brooklyn, Dillon and Lee in New York, and the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. Welcome, Gyun. We're so happy to have you here and to have your work in our space. Eileen, I'm actually going to let you go ahead and take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. And just before we start our conversation, I just want to start with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded homelands of the Lenape, the Munsee, the Manhattan, the Canarsie, and the Matinakak, the Shinnecock, and other indigenous nations. We respect that many indigenous people continue to live and work on this land and recognize their ongoing contributions to the region. We also acknowledge the enslaved Africans whose labor built and developed the Northeast during the colonial era and beyond. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much, Gyun. I'm delighted to share this space with you today. And I also wanted to let everyone know a little bit about the format of this conversation. Towards the end of the conversation, we'll have a special guest joining us, Shoshana Weinberger, who has an adjoining installation in the Sunroom Project space. And then we will screen an excerpt of Gyun's private performance at the end, and that's only available during this program. So thank you again, Gyun, for being here.
Thank you for having me. And also, as I'm just seeing the familiar names who are coming into this space, thank you for being here for this conversation. Hi, Jean. Also, Eileen, I just want to thank you so much. And I say that all the time because I'm sentimental like that, but just for seeing my work. And also, you are really one of the first curators to see my work in New York and just to host my work. And I can't think of a better place to hold this particular project than Sunroom, at Wave Hill. And you've witnessed my life past 1.5 years. And you were such a kind and patient listener and confident to kind of pull me through to make this project possible. So I just wanted to express my gratitude to you and the entire Wave Hill team. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Gyun, for your warm words. And it's been an amazing journey. And thank you for letting me be on this with you. It's been a long time. It's been a 1.5 years in the making. So it's really wonderful to see it come to fruition here at Wave Hill. And I'm just going to start sharing some images of the installation. So Gyun, I'm wondering if you can briefly describe So We Can Be Near to everyone and the process of this installation and even how it's changed since the beginning, maybe even since the proposal.
So often when I do think about my work, I think about, you know, how to create an emotive landscape, right? That holds often opposing things. And I think often in our lives, we're being asked to hold, contradictory, difficult things without finding any kind of resolution and still hold it. And for this particular project, this installation image that you're looking at, I'm thinking about how to hold two things, particular loss and beauty at the same time. So what you are looking at on the wall are 12 hand-blown glass vessels that holds two bodies of water, Hudson River, that's right by the Wave Hill, and Delaware River from Marysburg, New York. And then on the floor, what you're seeing on the floor is the vinyl. It's a composite of total 15 images that trace my family's migration. And then on top of it, the color yellow, the gradients of yellow that you're seeing are hand shredded silk flowers, which is really a signature material that I've been working with for past 10 years. And then the mirrors are kind of on the edge of the gallery space, and you will see it later a little bit more in details, but I hand etched hundreds of lines behind the mirrors to echo the imagery of a river. And I'll talk about also the significance of the river throughout the talk. And behind it, you can kind of see these wooden structures to not only hold the mirrors in the space, but also they are kind of like skeletons or bones, right, of the installation.
Can you tell us, there's a division of the teardrops on which hold the Hudson River and the Delaware River?
Yeah, so from the top to right side of the corner, 4 of them hold Hudson River. Hudson River considered to be the North River, and Delaware River, which is a larger body of river, and it's considered to be the South, is kind of on the left side of, and then at the bottom of the installation.
Thank you. I also have a close-up of them behind me here.
Yes, and I have some drops there too.
So I wonder if you can tell us about some of the inspirations for your work.
Yeah, so as we know, when I proposed for the Southern Project exhibition at Wave Hill, could you go back to the slide right before this one with a sketch? It was a proposal back in fall 2019. And during that time, the vision of wanting to create a space, an introspective space with hints of yellow light, hand-shredded yellow silk flowers with the vinyl prints on the floor. All of that was very clear to me, which I think sort of remains even after 1.5 years. And writing usually is a part of the way that I process the work. So after a site visit in fall 2019, I think, or no, actually spring 2020, right before the pandemic, it was literally unfolding. And during the train ride from Wave Hill back to the city, I actually ended up sketching this on the sketchbook I wrote a little bit. And I was particularly thinking at that time about silence, maybe silence of violence or violence of silence, that kind of thing. But it evolved. So if you go to the next image, as I was thinking about Wave Hill and getting to know Wave Hill's history being a private estate that's now open to public, I was reminded of the garden that my mother-in-law tends with her hands. And she's surrounded by lusciousness of the southern landscape in Tennessee. And these 2 images are from her garden, and I also have flowers from her garden this morning. There were a few questions that I was thinking about, and I was thinking about, whose right is it to own land? And how do we look after it? For what reason? And I was thinking about also kind of trauma that landscape often holds. And particularly because I grew up in the South, and my mother-in-law just being in Tennessee as well, that how the landscape of the South holds trauma for folks generationally, and how my story, her story sort of enter into that narrative. And her care, like her love for the garden really is so graceful, and it shows me a lot of resilience. And I think that really inspires me. So that imagery is one of the most prominent images on the floor vinyl. Go to the next image. During the pandemic, we've gone through so much as a community, and I don't even know if we're even able to grasp and process the magnitude of the losses. And we took a trip to Delaware River in winter 2020. That was one of the very first trips that, outside of being in the city, throughout the pandemic. And I was waking up to this view every morning. And as I was spending a really intimate time with it, I realized that the river's movement that was constantly moving was teaching me the movement of letting go and this kind of choreography of grief. So these two images then, if you go to the next slide, sort of appear as the image you're seeing on the left side is the prototype. And you can see it's got total 15 images tracing the migration from South Korea to, Atlanta, Georgia to, Tennessee to New York. But my mother-in-law, her figure and the Delaware River image becomes the most prominent in the installation.
You can see that fading pink fabric.
Yeah.
In the image.
Yeah.
And then I'm wondering if you can tell us more about, so your practice includes this hand shredding of flowers that you've been doing for the last decade. And can you tell us about that process? How long does that take? There's this invisible labor behind it. We can certainly see that you spent that, in creating this, but can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, my initial discovery of the silk flowers was from the cemetery, and I started collecting it during my graduate school years for 1.5 years. And, the cemetery flowers are symbolic objects for, remembering the loved ones. And what I really am fascinated about this material particularly is that it's so artificial and it does not decay. It defies the notion of life, the natural cycle of life, And yes, I hand shred them, and the process of making this material is long and relentless. And I think my particular relationship to labor is, I don't know, it's so embedded in me. I think growing up as an immigrant daughter with my parents as immigrant workers, that sort of relationship to labor is there. But I also, physically, it's just like spending a lot of time with the material and destroying it does something to my psyche. Like as I'm seeing the material altering its origin and value and form, somehow I feel altered. And during that transformation, I think I also kind of, my psyche also alters. So yes, I've been doing it for a long time.
Do you find it a meditative process?
Meditative and violent. Both.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And you talk about it as an artificial material, but when you stand up close to it, it actually looks like it could be pollen, or something natural.
Yes. A lot of people just assume that it's real flowers. Yeah. And I like that. I like that there's kind of, you can't really tell. Exactly. Yeah.
And then do you collect it all at the end and then repurpose it for future?
Right. I lose materials over time though, right? Every time I recollect the mixed ones, I can't really use it anymore and things like that. But I try to recollect if I can, as much as I can. Yes. So these two images are images of me traveling back to Narrowsburg to collect water from Delaware River. And also Hudson River, right by the train station, 10 minutes walk down from Wave Hill. So the imagery of the river kind of has become significant in this work, not only it holds, you know, not only it holds like a visual aspect of the work, but then I think I really valued my memory of seeing the river and it teaching me again that choreography of grief, and also it as like a provider of life. And so I started doing some research on Delaware River and Hudson River, and I was able to trace like such a power of river generating life. Historically, before the settlement, the Lenape people really flourished, especially on Delaware River. And it was called, Lenape River, because that's the river, one of the larger, bodies of water that Native Americans were able to sort of settle and flourish within. And as I was doing also more research on river, I was reminded by this very specific reference to river baptism in the South. And this spiritual quality that I feel like the river holds, this idea of the rebirth, was very important for the show. So that's what you're looking at in these two images.
And I know we'll touch more upon this later, but you can see the inspiration of the river and then the hundreds of lines that you've etched, in your installation.
Yeah.
And so this idea of teardrops as part of your installation, I think developed a little bit more recently, like it wasn't in the original proposal. And I'm wondering if you can walk us through the significance of including them as part of your installation.
Yeah. So as the project was evolving, as I was like writing and thinking about the project, and as the months were like, as weeks were approaching to the installation phase, like pretty close to that, like maybe a month or 2 months away, I felt that I really felt like I needed to have the presence of river water in the installation. But I didn't know how to hold, like, how am I gonna bring that water and have it being held? And I was thinking about different forms that could hold water. So I was taking a walk in the morning in Prospect Park, and I was suddenly reminded by Kiki Smith's teardrops glasswork that I just saw it a few days ago before that walk, from like a book that I ended up purchasing, and it kind of clicked. I was like, yes, right, it will be accessible. It will be a way for me to be able to hold this river that means a life for me. And but also it alludes to sort of this notion of grief, right? It captures also the idea of grief. Like, so what a beautiful way to hold these two opposing things. And I thought that was really beautiful. So I worked with an amazing glass artist, Yi Wei, and we came up with a design. If you go to the slide right before that, like a teardrop in different variations of forms and sizes, and we just made a little hole behind it, not just to hang it, but also to insert and pour out the river water. So, and the glass artist, Yi, is the one who told me about lacrimatory. And when I was, sketching these little shapes, I want the shape, and I want to hold the water inside there. And she's like, have you heard of lacrimatory? And I was like, no. And she told me that it's a Victorian object, right? That mourners would collect tears during funerals or during their grieving time. And the idea is that when, the collected shed tears are all evaporated, that your grieving period is over. And I just thought, and I clinged onto that because I thought that was so beautiful. And I was also reminded of this particular performance that I did back in 2008. Called 7 Days of Mourning, where I mourned and wailed for 7 days. And as I was putting these images together, I was really struck also by the image of female identifying bodies in grief. Beyond cultural context, how it looks quite, right? So I was quite stunned by that.
And then during the course the exhibition, the water will likely, start to or evaporate over time. And I wanted to let you know that sediment is collecting on the bottom. So I'll make sure to take a photo for you. But it's amazing to see it change over time because it is water that you collected from the rivers.
That's incredible. Yes, please share the photos with me. And I think that was also kind of like I wanted the installation to have like kind of like a life and progression throughout the show. Yeah. Oh yeah, and I just kind of thought that it would be interesting to, of course, to reference Stephen Smith's work, but also Fred Wilson's interpretation of glass, like the material glass and the teardrop shapes. Oh, yeah, go ahead. It's my favorite slide.
I feel like, when people walk into the space, they are looking down, at your installation, but there are so many different perspectives to see, the infiniteness that you've captured in these mirrors. And here is a perfect example of that.
I know, and it's really one of my favorite slides. What I use mirrors in the work, and what mirrors do for me is it creates kind of this elusive space that it's not real, right? The imagery that gets mirrored in the material. So not only it expands the space visually, but it also creates this illusion that it's a space in which I can dwell when I have to unravel and then get untethered emotionally or psychologically. So I like using it. But in this particular piece at Wave Hill, so we can be near, I met many families and also different children. And, the way I love talking to them, and the way that I would have them kind of start getting engaged and to enter the work is for me to ask them, could you see if you can see yourselves by laying down on the floor and just putting your bodies on the floor, and then they start to see themselves mirrored back and they start to communicate with the work, right? So this particular Ethan Berry was really engaged, and he was taking pictures and seeing himself mirrored back and starting to recognize some details of the work. And I think about, right, like people's or one's willingness to alter their positionality or their bodies, right? To have different perspectives or access to the work. And children have very unhindered way of seeing the world. And there's a smaller image, which is from 2014, an installation piece, A System of Interiority. It was a very similar height. And children often really interacted with kind of the world underneath, so yeah, and I just want to take a moment to thank Ethan to giving me a permission to use his image.
And I did, for a tour of adults, mention that if they wanted to crouch down and have a different perspective of your installation. So quite a few of them did.
Oh, that's lovely. Yes.
But it's amazing to see. I mean, I know this installation is roped off because of the delicacy, of the shredded flowers on the vinyl print, but there's so many, as you've mentioned, ways to access your installation, even if you can't physically step inside of it.
Right.
And performance is also a big part of your practice, and different performance artists have influenced your work. And so everyone knows, at the end of this program, we'll screen the excerpt of the private performance. And I wanted to talk about, you've done both public performances and private performances, and the one for Wave Hill was private, that you did at the end of May. And can you talk about not only your influences, but also about how that's different for you, how that experience is different, what kind of purposes do they each serve?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Um, it's quite a, I think when I feel very moved and like I think my body is like asking me to engage with the work, and often there's like a particular urgency that I need to do a performance, and often whether it's going to be public or private, often if I do have an option to do a private, then I do. And I guess the privacy for this work, not only it was because of the pandemic, but I was thinking a lot about protection of my body and my story and my privacy, right? Because often when you do performances and offer your body to the public, especially when you are offering your body in context of your identity, body in which you cannot escape, right? That often comes with a lot of violence, that it's emotionally very costly. So for this particular piece, it became very clear to me that it needed it to be private and that I needed it to be alone in this space to document it by myself, even though that meant that the documentation itself wasn't going to be very highly produced. And you're looking at an image of Kyung Kang's work, a recent work called Traces, and she spent 28 days at Elizabeth Murray's estate barn studio back in 2019 through the residency. And what she did was she spent every day in Elizabeth Murray's studio and really traced the residues that she has left, the artist left. And what I find so stunning about this piece is she just kind of like allowed her body to respond and eventually communicate with basically the spirit of the artist, right? And that there, as a non-dancer, to be able to move her body in response to and in that space, to me was really beautiful. And as days went, her movement became more clear and succinct as well and more expressive. Mm-hmm. And also Kyungwon, she's a dear friend and a beautiful soul. We were introduced to through Jean, actually. So I really want to acknowledge that and thank her for that as well. And it's my first time actually putting our works together. We don't, we go to performances together and we talk about things, but to see our works such in parallel was really moving for me. Yeah.
What is she tracing with? Her fingers?
She's tracing the spirit, and sometimes she uses brooms and she moves furnitures in the studio. But in this particular case, she's just locating, I think, different spot, like paint marks basically on the wall. Yeah.
And such a parallel for you where you're tracing, certain aspects of your installation. In this view, you're touching the teardrop.
That's right.
And then later we'll see you touching the etchings on the mirror.
This is also, so as I was thinking about my work in context of Kyungwon, and then knowing that Trisha Brown actually did a recent performance at Wave Hill, I was reminded of some other artists, and I put these two images together, works by Anna Mendieta and Janine Antoni. And what you're seeing on the left is Anna Mendieta's body at a grave site covered with wildflowers, and Janine Antoni's image is her collaboration with Anna Hoffman, who recently passed away, with the piece titled Paper Dance. And what I find is so stunning is these two female identifying artists who are diaspora. So the biography is interesting. Anna Manieta being the exile from Cuba and moving to the States, particularly in Iowa at the age of 12. And Janine Antoni she grew up in Bahamas and moved to the States when she was 13. And kind of, I guess, and I know that experience also from my personal biography, and that sort of like sudden rupture, right, in your life, and how these two women artists, diasporic women artists, are using their bodies as sites and also agency, right, holding trauma and dislocation, but as well as this deep generation of life. was so moving. So, you know, when I sometimes feel alone in my practice, or when I feel like, am I going crazy? Like, you know, doing stuff that I do, I go to these artists for, you know, a little bit of that assurance that I'm not, you know, I'm not going crazy, and that there are many, there are beautiful lineage of artists who have done this before me, and I find a lot of strength from it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The spirituality of, you know, dealing with labor, life. Yeah, there's so many connections there. And another connection I wanted to point out, you brought up Trisha Brown, and Trisha Brown studied with Anna Halpern, you know, in the 60s, and she learned to use these task-like structures from Halpern. So it's, yeah, come full circle.
It's like such a beautiful lineage kind of trickling down, no? And yeah, again, I'm realizing how important it is not only for me to trace like the cultural lineage that I have and familial, but also, you know, within our history, there are artists who have done so many things that I'm questioning and wrestling with, you know, before me. And, you know, so yeah.
And here, we'll talk about briefly your previous work, and to see how that progression and development has affected your current installation.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight this particular piece. I wouldn't know any other way back in 2020. It was part of a group show, Death Becomes Her, curated by Jenny Giro and Harry Whale at Brick. And this is an important show because it was one of very few group shows in which a large scale installation of mine could be included, which is an unusual situation and opportunity. And I also want to thank Jenny for just being that person who also listened and gave me that trust to experiment. So this is my first piece wherein which I'm using a vinyl on the floor and putting that hand shredded silk flowers on top of it and really immersing my body in that installation and adding the performative aspect as like such an essential part of the piece. So those shifts happen for the first time in this piece. And if you go to the next slide, is a piece from 2011. So that's exactly 10 years ago. And this piece titled In a Landscape Anew, I was taking some time to look at this work and images, and I was quite struck by like, oh, I'm using mirrors and wooden structures, armatures in such a similar way. But I was also struck by kind of the opaqueness in the work. And when I think about the work at Wave Hill, I'm starting to kind of notice that perhaps the work itself is kind of like opening up, yeah, visually and conceptually. Yeah, so it's kind of nice to trace it back.
I mean, opening up with the structures that you see here. Did you want to touch upon that a little bit? The structural.
Yeah, so if you look at the 2011 In a Landscape Anew, you can see that I covered it with a fake, you know, grass tarp, because I knew that structurally that I needed it to sort of hide that, you know, in a way. But the next one, people often ask me like, you know, in a conversation before the show or after the show, were you gonna cover it? You know, are you gonna cover it? And I don't know, I was like, you know, this time I think I'm gonna just let it be opened. And that was my intuitive decision. But eventually what it dawned to me was like, I think I'm gonna, you know, let the image continue through those bonus structures with the wood. And let the image breathe through the wooden structures. And it really kind of dawned to me that these are like skeletons, basically. Yeah.
And they seem to serve as a metaphor for this raw grief or emotion. You know, these structures are left open and not covered.
You're right, because also through the mirrors, what you see inside of the mirrors, inside of the installation is pretty sleek. You know, it's very illusionary and beautiful, and you know, but then behind it, you're seeing all these like pretty raw stuff. You know, So yeah, absolutely. And then you will see it in my performance excerpt, but you will see that I'm making contacts with the installation, not only on the floor, but actually the wooden structures supporting my body. And I realized, wow, it's serving me in an interesting way when I was making contacts with installation. So I found that really beautiful.
And while you're installing, Shoshana Weinberger is also installing in the adjacent space that we can see here, Fragments of Perception. And we're going to bring her in for a conversation. Just want to show what Shoshana's installation looks like.
Yeah, and these two photos are so beautiful because it also captures the uniqueness of the sunroom gallery and sun porch. Beautiful windows, and it's just so absolutely beautiful there. So
I'm going to bring Shoshana in.
hi, Shoshana.
Hi, everybody. Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And I have to say, it's so lovely to see your process in all this. And I was actually thinking about the title of your work, So We Can Be Near, and how we have all not been able to be near each other. And so it really envelopes into these lovely connections between, our work both referencing water, my work referencing the aquatic gardens, and thinking about the idea of memory, time, loss, identity in both of our pieces. And I really think that it was much anticipated. So, I mean, I think we've been living with it, it's become a child all this time, and to have our installations be together, thanks to Eileen for
Yes.
sort of marrying our voices and having this discussion, the visual discussion of how identity, relationships, loss, how the body kind of influences your work. I'm excited to see the performance. And I love the aspect that there is that memory there, that you take performance as another sort of medium in the piece. And that also you utilize light. We both are utilizing light as another, it should be even like light as like a media, because you're utilizing how light, in your case, actual water reflects in the colored gels, and the idea that the yellow sort of reminds us of the sun, but it also reminds us of loss at morning. This idea that we're both utilizing things that we can't compost, so like the yellow flowers that that are not live, and that my work has the double-sided reflective plastic mirror, acrylic mirrors, and they can't, they're not landfill friendly. And so we're sort of like mimicking nature in this material, and we're pushing and pulling it. And it's just really, I like taking so many other notes here because it was so lovely to see that process, from your train ride sketch. And I think that, we both actually have had all this time to really sit with the work. And if every artist could have that much time,
yeah, it's true. We should have a,
yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? So I know it's been a year and a half, and but you both have been developing the work, individually, but in parallel. And then can you tell us about, when we can finally we could be on site and the installation can begin? Tell us about that experience for you both.
I mean, for me, I was very, sort of focused. I think we both are very focused. We have things detailed out. And I think that we both respected each other's space, and then we, knock, knock, knock. Hey, what's going on? Or seeing a moment of a tearful moment, where I think it's really special to be an artist who can create things and then see it and then step away from it and see how it kind of grows and becomes its own animal, and it affects and invites and stimulates the people that are engaging in it. And I really think that there's like a similar way that we sort of took on and used the space to its fullest advantage. And so that's kind of like, I'm going to let you talk. That's how, I think that there's like an external, internal dialogue going on. I think that my work is very centered in the space, allowing the light to become part of the piece. There's a performative aspect to the leaves moving just ever so, and there's a performative aspect of light changing the pieces, both our pieces, in many cases, where it might be a dark sky or a bright sun, and how the elements of nature, the elements of what's at Wave Hill sort of engages our works. Yeah.
Yeah. And, after all of us having gone through the pandemic of like such an inward, like time being alone. And I think that was quite a time, and we were all just coming out of it. And Shoshana was really the very first artist whom I came in contact with so intimately, so intensively, and I couldn't have asked for a better artist. Again, Eileen, you being the genius that's carrying us too. And the architecture of that space, because it is through the windows and we could see each other in space and still feel connected. Mm-hmm. And there are 3 favorite memories of that week. One was like having lunch with you, Shoshana, in the back porch. And we're just like, oh, this is my favorite part, like installing and having lunch, and getting to know you through the week. And another favorite memory was like me just kind of watching you through the windows from my space, like when you poured out the fiberglass on your thing, and then the light just bursted into the space, and I was seeing lights all over the space. And I was just like I was just videotaping you because you were so in it and immersed in the process. And I know what that feels like. And it was just nice to witness that. And then the third favorite memory was, when I, I cry a lot. So when I hung that first teardrop on the wall with the water, and then when we,
you were, I just looked over at her and I knew that feeling. Especially when you're collaborating, you have this long anticipated, voice and visual language you want to impart to the world. And the making and the anticipation, I really connected with you in that moment too. I even kind of like was driving home going, oh my gosh, I know that feeling, and especially when we have, in certain cases, fabricators that don't want to work with you at the moment because, what's an art project over PPE, and, working with stuff for my end, and then finally getting things made and done. And there's a release, like this is not in a sketchbook anymore. And, I really loved some of your thought process. Even at the end, you did a surprise thing, like day of the opening. And it just like added this moment. And there's all these lovely moments in your installation, the lights the skeleton frame, like you're exposing the architecture that you're creating, you're exposing the architecture of reflection. And so really, really loved how you sort of navigated and how you are really thinking your thought process. I felt very connected.
And when those moments were happening, like hanging the tear and me just kind of feeling like, oh my gosh, and then I see you and you're nodding, you're holding that space for me, and when I was like having a little like moment, I can go, Shoshana, can I talk to you? And then in the moment, you're like, yeah. And then, on the day of opening, after like a really hard conversation with a partner about like, there's still something missing in the installation, and what is it? What is it? What is it? And making the final decision to sort of like pour that pensionist of flowers behind the mirrors and like pouring that out. And when I was doing that, I saw you again, you were just like nodding. You're like, I see you, and I'm gonna hold that. I'm gonna hold a space for you. And having that actually made me feel so like seen and supported. So and having your work as a companion, was just, so thank you for that.
Yeah, I think that the space flows, and I think it tells our visual stories really, really well. I don't think there's no competing. It's like this beautiful friendship, and it's extended in the work. So yeah, I'm really, I wish the show was on longer, but, but I just had to say
Travel
that.
it.
Yeah. I have a question. I don't know if I can. I have a question just in terms of that, actually. And I was wondering, do you see this installation in a different space? Have you thought about that? I mean, I've been thinking about that. People have been asking me about my piece, which is solely, really for the sun porch. But then I've been thinking about where else it could live, and with your work and the water samples and just the performance, I'm curious.
I think anywhere that has river.
Yeah.
So if there's anybody here who would like to host my work, I'll be happy to. I'm hoping that this work has like a longer life than Wave Hill. So I know it's coming to closure in 1.5 weeks or so. So I hope that it has a little longer life.
Yeah, and I have one more question. Just I wanted to know, in your process, maybe with this one or with other processes, do you start or think about the idea of the initial idea as a poem? Is it a feeling, because you use performance? Is it a shape? Just thinking about what came first in this piece. I know we had a long time to kind of like think about that, but I just was curious.
Yeah, actually the title of the show, So We Can Be Near, is a repeated phrase from a poem that I ended up writing, thinking about the show. But I think I was asked a similar question a few days ago, and when I thought about it, I think I have like months of not making work. And then it's like, but I think I tend to process and look at my life very, very intensively. I feel things really deeply, and I look into my life like really, really with maybe a little too much intensity. And I think my work comes from that. It really comes from where my life is, at and was, and what I hope to, so this show is especially, I think, it really came out of my life.
Great, thank you. Beautiful piece. I'm again so glad. I can't wait to go back and sort of sit with the works without an event. So.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. So thank you both. Thank you both so much. Thank you, Shoshana, for joining us for this conversation. And now we're going to open it up to the audience.
Yeah, I see. I mean, hi, Crystal. I see you. Thanks for crying with me, Jane and Crystal, and yeah, it was a really special relationship with Shoshana. Yeah, feel free to type in any questions that you may have.
You can either use the Q&A or the chat, so feel free to do either. In the meantime, Gyun, you had talked about how your installation encompasses life, and I'm wondering, you also discussed how it traces the migration of you and your family. And that leads me to think about notions of home and what is that? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think the notion of home is like where I know that I can be untethered, knowing that I'm gonna be okay, being held, you know? And I think when I think about like a child, you know, like having like a little meltdown and, you know, you have a parent who can hold you, you know, and it's gonna be okay. Like that to me is home, right? Um, and I think, so, so I think I often try to find home in the installations in which I make. And with I wouldn't know any other way. And so we can be near in these 1.5 years where in which I could actually be in it. I felt like I could actually find home, you know. So I see a question. Do you ever worry about long-term toll on your hands and body and the cost and sacrifice that becomes part of the overall work? Wow. Wow. Thank you for that question, Jane. Especially knowing that how laborious your work is too. And I think often we reject or refuse to feel or acknowledge the toll that the invisible labor has on us, right? Because I think we've seen that from our parents. So we don't, there's kind of like not so much care of the body, you know? And I think I am recently realizing that it's gonna have a toll on me. And I'm gonna have to really care for that, you know? And it's not only the physical toll, but also emotional toll. And I think that's why I made that decision to actually do the performance privately and physically. Yeah, I have to figure that out.
Thank you, Crystal, for asking that question. And then there's also a question from Jean about, can you talk about the topic of healing in your work, and in particular with this project?
I think, I mean, in the actually recent book of Asian American artists writing letters, that Shin actually wrote how art saved her, and I can only say that also for myself. You know, I find so much healing in art, making work. You know, whether it's gonna be in public or not, the very gesture or act of and making the decision to, you know, I'm gonna just come out of the world and just live through my work as an expression of where I am. And I think that ends up becoming really healing for me. So, yeah.
Thank you. And we have another question from Janine Lambin. Any thoughts of doing tiny traveling works, almost like tiny memento mori? I'm just thinking of Victorian lockets and other portable vessels and expressions of memory.
Wow. Yes, I'm gonna think about that. Yes, thank you for that beautiful suggestion. Yeah, I think that would be such a lovely thing to do because often my work is very immobile. So yeah.
The teardrops.
Yes, they are mobile. So I'm getting I feel a little like freer knowing that some works are portable. Because, yeah. Jody, performing in person anytime soon. I may be performing, I haven't decided yet, but with the upcoming exhibition in Charleston, I may actually do a day performance and see how that feels like. But it seems like I'm constantly, you know, interrogating my decision making just to make sure that it really aligns with the work. So, oh, Tracy, so good to see you here.
And we have a question from Harley Greco. Thank you for this presentation. Beautiful show. Do you see your body as a conduit between the tear vessels and the flower image installation?
Yeah, I realized that, Harley, that's such a beautiful observation after seeing the performance. I wasn't aware, and then when I saw the documentation of my body kind of almost floating because it's being held with the wooden structures between the teardrops and the installation, that yeah, so that was quite yeah, I saw that, and thank you for seeing that, Harley. Should we perhaps then screen a short excerpt? And I'm gonna talk about this a little bit because we're gonna start recording before the screening. But you know, it's a very short excerpt, about 3.5 minutes, of one particular gesture of me tracing the etched lines on the mirrors. And I had 2 cameras, so you will see the performance from 2 perspectives. And the beginning and the end of the film, it will be silent, but in the middle, you will hear my humming and river sound. And it's a recording that I actually ended up doing when I went to Delaware River to collect water there. And I hummed the song titled 사랑으로, which means by love or through love. And it's a song that I grew up singing in Korea in my childhood. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it.
We're going to screen the private performance right now. Julia, I see that you have a question. I just want to let everyone know that we will be holding space after the performance. So until 3:15, if you'd like to stay on and chat with Gyun, you're more than welcome to. But right now we're going to screen the performance.